Can you all hear me? All right, thanks, Marissa. It's me again. Send me enough this semester. So this is it's gonna be a last time to see me. So
No.
But I'm really honored to introduce our esteemed annual William Brown speaker, and William Brown Memorial Lecture speaker today, Dr. Thurston, who comes from University of Cincinnati in Ohio. Before I do that, I want to just say a few words about the annual William Brown Lecture. Since I arrived in 2020, 2022. Oh, okay. I've tried to raise the profile of Islamic studies and Islam in Africa on campus, and I've received a great support from my colleagues. So Neil Kodesh has been really great support in terms of organizing, helping me thinking about ways of brainstorming ideas and things about how to do that. Ali Mukor has been really great. So one of the ways of doing this is to raise interest, really revive interest in this lecture. So I'm gonna say a few words about William E. Brown, for those who don't know him. William Brown earned a PhD in history at the UW-Madison. And he was professor here for almost 30 years. And he retired in 2006. Before coming here, Professor Brown taught at Ahmed Bello University in Nigeria. He also taught at Yale and Harvard, and he received many grants while he was here. Brown also was instrumental in organizing the first conference on Black Studies at the University of Wisconsin here. He also published some important work, articles. And while Professor Brown did not publish much, he left really an enduring impact on the development of studies of Islam in Africa. He was one of the most, I think, he was really one of the most underappreciated scholars in our field, but that doesn't mean that he did not have an impact. He has an impact on mentoring students. He's really an impact in terms of his teaching, as well as the kind of archival material that was able to collect and made available for scholars and students. As a matter of fact, the Journal of African History has dedicated its most recent issue on his work and his life, trying to reflect on his intellectual work and his contribution. And so really, this issue really provide really an important kind of, for me, even I'm, a scholar in this field, this issue really, I learned a great deal when I read those articles. So, it's really do some justice to this important figure who's really underappreciated. So now I'm gonna try to introduce our speaker. Dr. Alexander Thurston is an associate professor of political science at the University of Cincinnati. Previously taught at Georgetown University and Miami University. He specializes in the studies of Islam and politics in West Africa and North Africa. He holds a PhD in religious studies from Northwestern University and an MA in Arab studies from Georgetown. He has published 3 books, and most recently, Jihads of North Africa and the Sahel, Local Politics and Rebel Groups. And he has published many numerous articles in top journals. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Thurston. Switch this on.
kept to be participate in the as I'm gonna talking about what what he has to say. My project with looking, as the title suggests, at northern Nigeria, approximately from the 1940s through the 1960s. In terms of the origin of the project, and I should say my plan is to talk for approximately half an hour about the book project, and then if there's time, if I'm controlling myself well, then say 5 minutes or so about the current situation in the Sahel, because Khaled and others indicated to me that this is a topic of considerable interest to people here as elsewhere. If somehow I don't get to the current politics of the Sahel, then happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So back to the book project. This research actually picks up on part of my dissertation, which was, again, more historical in nature, and came out of a set of questions for me about how Nigeria is connected to the wider Muslim world, in particular to the Arab world. And I became, as part of that, very interested in delegations of Nigerian students who were sent to Sudan and to the United Kingdom in the 1950s, and their broader kind of career arc, impact on the northern Nigerian elite and on key decisions that were made around the transition to independence. I've also been thinking a lot about the new literature that's come out in the past decade or so on Islamic law and colonialism, such as Isa Hassan's book, Elizabeth Lost's book recently, looking more at the Asian context, but thinking about some of the ramifications for this literature in terms of understanding of Africa, and then also trying to shift the chronological lens a little bit to think about, okay, what was the trajectory of Islamic law and Islamic thought during this moment of decolonization? Another kind of thread I'm interested in is the prehistory of Salafism. So I've done work on Salafism much closer to the present, but looking back at, and Salafism, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a kind of literalist current within Sunni Islam that depicts itself as a direct instantiation of the early period of Islam in the present, but that has been understood by historians of the 20th century movement. And so looking at some of the formation of that in the African context. And then also, my career so far has overlapped with serious episodes of violence in Nigeria through the Boko Haram movement, in Mali through the rise of various jihadist movements there, and many other types of violent movements as well. My concern has been that the violence and the attention to the violence by scholars and analysts sometimes crowds out other topics and other potential avenues of inquiry. And I've felt that myself. And so I'm trying actually to step back from analyzing some of the violence, some of the hot button topics now, and return to what I see as actually more, deeper historical questions. In terms of the key questions that animate this project specifically, they would be the four that I've listed here. I think to explain the second part of the first question a little bit, I think this is a simile that I find sort of evocative, but that I think also fails in certain ways. So on one level, we could say that Islam is like water. Water takes the shape of its container. So does Islam take the shape of the societies that it passes through? We could also say maybe Islam is like water in another way, in that water has this kind of effect on the territories and the topography that it passes over. Water can wear channels and grooves. Water can shape things as it passes through. So this is one simile that's been on my mind. At the same time, I would say the simile fails, right? Because Islam is made up of people. Islam is very much what people do, and a debate among the people themselves. And we'll come back maybe to this point. But these are some of the key questions then that have animated the book. In terms of the scope of the project, So looking at northern Nigeria as a formal political unit that existed between 1900 and 1966, or into 1967, and that's distinct from lowercase n northern Nigeria as more of a cultural and religious and political idea. And then I'm interested in the entire colonial period through the early independence era, but specifically I'm focusing on the 1940s through the 1960s. So from the beginnings of what we could call sort of proto-political activities and discussion circles and clubs, and I'll also talk about the rise of newspapers and a certain kind of print culture. That's kind of one starting point, and then the ending point is the first coup of 1966 in Nigeria, which brought an end in various ways to northern Nigeria as a political unit, but then also to some of the Islamic projects that I'm describing here. In terms of the key terms and phrases, concepts that I've wrestled with in working on the book, the first is Tal al-Assad's very famous idea of Islam as a discursive tradition. So Assad was reacting to two ideas in formulating this. On the one side, he was reacting against conceptions of Islam as what he called a determinate social blueprint. So the idea that Islam kind of laid out a way that society should be structured, and then people followed that. And he, to paraphrase and simplify somewhat crudely, I think he found that reduced people to too robotic of actors, right? If Islam is just sort of a blueprint that people implement. On the other hand, he was also reacting against the idea that there are just many Islams, and that Islam is just simply what Muslims say it is. I think he found this kind of too loose. So his then solution was to describe Islam as a discursive tradition, as a set of practices that are handed down among Muslims, that are, from parents to children or from sheikhs to students, and that Islam then was again this discursive tradition. My kind of critique of that and how I've been wrestling with that is I think I also want to pay attention to institutions and infrastructures and to get beyond the idea of sort of Islam is Muslims talking about Islam. I find sort of there's a recursivity almost in this definition of the discursive tradition. And to think about also how I think Assad's formulation works well for explaining continuity, but then maybe works less well for explaining kinds of discontinuity. If Islam is just a discursive tradition that's handed down, how would there be change? And also I want to account for how external actors, non-Muslim actors in particular, obviously the British colonial power in Nigeria, how they sought to shape and affect Islam. Then a key idea for the book, a second key idea has been the public sphere. So public sphere comes out of the thinking of the German philosopher Habermas, who describes the public sphere as not just any debate that happens in public, but as this specific space that is distinct from the state and that is distinct from the private sphere. And Habermas has been criticized extensively, and I think very fairly, for what is an elitist, bourgeois, and male-centric vision of the public sphere. And I think he upholds a particular kind of European experience. At the same time, and Nancy Fraser and others have really critiqued the kinds of exclusions that Habermas makes in talking about the public sphere. He's also been, I think, credibly critiqued for a kind of an ahistorical depiction of the public sphere. At the same time, his depiction of a very elite, male-centric, exclusive space actually fits pretty well what I want to describe in northern Nigeria during this time. This is an elite kind of public sphere that I want to talk about from the 1940s to the 1960s. Habermas and then also Benedict Anderson, I'll talk about in just a second, they both use religion as a kind of foil. Habermas depicts religion as privatized and suggests, I think, that this is part of why you could have this sort of rational, critical debate within the public sphere is his idea that religion had been privatized. And Anderson also uses religion as a kind of a foil too. But there's been a lot of interesting and I think, really exciting work about Islamic public spheres. In particular, Robert Launay and Benjamin Suarez have described what they see as an Islamic public sphere in the French colonial territories in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali and elsewhere, where Muslims, partly because of the ways that the French colonial project allowed people to move around and brought people in contact with one another, changed the economy, all this, Lane and Suarez argue, created this kind of Islamic public sphere where people were suddenly debating on a much wider scale, and at a faster rate, what it meant to be Muslim. And so this has been very influential too in terms of my own thinking about northern Nigeria during this time. I want to think basically about a particular kind of elite community in northern Nigeria, how they thought about Islam. And so Benedict Anderson's famous formulation of nationalism as being about imagined communities has also been very useful to me, because I think the formation of this elite public in Nigeria, in northern Nigeria, rested in part on acts of imagination, on the ability to imagine people that one might never meet, or who were at least a couple degrees of separation away from any given person. At the same time, I find Anderson's description of the imagined community to be a little bit faceless. In northern Nigeria, people were connected to one another. The people who were involved in this act of collective imagination had often gone to school together, they worked together, they wrote together, they co-authored. And so the kind of, public sphere that I want to talk about was peopled by specific people who often knew each other very, very well. And I find actually maybe more useful than Anderson's description of the imagined community is his description of the itineraries of civil servants and colonial functionaries, how going from one place to another would expose them to different people, to different ideas. Anderson in a way lays some of this out as well in his own book. Partha Chatterjee's critique of Anderson has also been very useful in terms of talking about how anti-colonial nationalism, in his view, was not just a kind of a modular form of European nationalism, but was a fundamentally different project constituted in part through anti-colonial nationalists demarcating what he calls a space of spiritual sovereignty in colonial society before beginning anti-colonial political activities. My own sort of hesitation about applying either Chatterjee or Anderson in the Northern Nigerian case, that the Northern Nigerian case is shot through with ambivalences and ambiguity. So was Northern Nigeria a distinct political unit, a Muslim political unit? What was its place within a multi-religious, multi-ethnic Nigeria? These are questions I think that the political elite of Northern Nigeria didn't settle during their own moment, right? Was there a kind of Northern Nigerian nationalism? I would say yes. On the other hand, was that a full-blown nationalism? No, because it was partly constrained by being within the Nigerian project. Similarly, with this idea of spiritual sovereignty, were there spaces of spiritual sovereignty within the Northern Nigerian Islamic arena? Yes. At the same time, the colonial influence was deep-rooted and profound, and there were all sorts of what I would call neo-colonial patterns, even at the moment of independence, influencing legal reform, influencing education, influencing all sorts of things. So to me, talking about some totalizing space of spiritual sovereignty wouldn't fully apply. The last kind of key term then is Islamic modernism. So Islamic modernism refers to the self-conscious effort by Muslim thinkers to Islamize modernity and to modernize Islam. And this is particularly associated with Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, with Muhammad Abdu, with Rashid Rida. Sometimes Islamic modernism is depicted as a kind of global movement that rose and fell over the course of about 1840 to 40. So that it peaked, especially with, again, Abdu and Rida, who were essentially turn of the century figures. Rida died in 1935. I think there's substantial evidence. I think this is sort of a Middle East-centric depiction of Islamic modernism. I think looking outside of the Middle East, to Africa, I would argue, to Pakistan, elsewhere, one can see a profound influence of Islamic modernism well after its supposed peak in 1940, or its supposed decline in 1940. Okay, the core arguments of the book then have to do with sketching what I see as a public Islam in northern Nigeria, an Islam that was that flowed through and also was constituted by, and then in turn helped to constitute a particular kind of public sphere that had to do with both discourses and infrastructures that reflected a lot of colonial attitudes, but also contained a dose of anti-colonialism and was not fully reducible to these colonial influences. I think it had a lot to do with emerging media forms, so newspapers, print culture, the radio. All of these were key sort of elements of fashioning this what I call public Islam. And then I think there was a heavily didactic component, a bypassing in a lot of ways of traditionalist sheikhs, a bypassing of the idea that knowledge should be handed down from sheikh to student, and then through a human chain. More of a confidence in deriving Islamic knowledge from books. More of a confidence that the lay Muslim could read books, maybe even unmediated, and understand Islam for themselves directly from sources. So a big part of what I'm looking at for public Islam was translation of the Quran into the Hausa language, translation of hadith collections into the Hausa language. And so I think there was this emphasis on the kind of lay Muslim reader as an individual, but then I think those individual readers were also conceived of as part of a mass public, and this sort of public Islam had key political significance for the leadership at the time. In terms of the key leaders and figures and institutions that I'm looking at, I'm mostly interested in basically two tracks of late colonial and early independence era elite, almost all of whom went through colonial schools and went through the top colonial schools, where they were intensely exposed to colonial efforts to fashion them, including to fashion them as particular kinds of Muslims. So basically I talk about two tracks, which we could call in a way the Anglophone track and the Arabophone track. So on the one hand were students who were sent to Katsina College, where they essentially went to what was supposed to be a version of a British boarding school for Muslim youth from the top echelons of the northern Nigerian society. Although the British had significant trouble recruiting students and convincing parents to send their children at times. And these students then at Katsina College were groomed as the future administrators, and that proved to be correct. So the top graduates of the school were at the top of the political class at the moment of transition to independence. Above all, Ahmadu Bello, who's you can see in both photos here, but who's the figure in the foreground at the top here. And Bello then, extremely complex figure, conservative in some ways, progressive in others. Came out of the elite, but then was very oriented toward kind of mass politics, came out of the hereditary Muslim establishment of the North, was a direct descendant of Uthman Dan Fodio, but then also challenged the hereditary Muslim leadership, the emirs and so forth in another way. Interested in Nigerian unity, but on a basis that would be dominated by the North, but also interested in exploring kinds of pan-Islamic solidarities, including in ways that made some Southern Nigerians very uncomfortable. Then on the other side is what I call the Arabophone track. So the British had what started as the Northern Provinces Law School and then became the School for Arabic Studies, where they sought to train, in their view, quote unquote, modern Islamic judges, clerks, so forth. The foremost representative of this trend is Abu Bakr Gumi, who's the figure sort of in the right down here, famous later for being basically the progenitor and the key mover in the Salafi movement in Nigeria, especially from the 1970s on. But here I'm interested in an earlier phase of his career where he was writing Islamic literature, doing translations, and then serving as the Grand Qadi, or the chief Islamic judge of northern Nigeria from 1962 till the end of the northern region. Okay. In terms of other institutions beyond schools, I'm interested in basically publishing ventures, institutions of higher education, especially the newspaper Gaskiya Tafikwabo, which was a Hausa language newspaper started by the colonial authorities, but which became a kind of discussion space and venue for people to exchange ideas and again to kind of constitute this public, in my view. Okay, in terms of the sources and methods for the project, fairly straightforward, archival research in Nigeria, archival research in the UK, I was able to interview some of the kind of surviving members of that generation. And then key to me have been various memoirs and different, primary source texts produced by people. So Ahmadu Bello's memoir, Abu Bakr Gumi's memoir, Abu Bakr Imam's memoir, also the rich actually literature about this period. And then another kind of source for me has been treating secondary sources as primary sources. So for example, there's a book called Al-Thaqafa Al-Arabiya fi Nigeria, a book, Arabic Culture in Nigeria, by Aliyu Abu Bakr, who was one of the key kind of Arabophones I'm talking about. Very useful to me as a secondary source for the way that he treats sort of history and the way that he did extensive field work among some of the Islamic institutions in Nigeria, but then also valuable as a primary source for seeing how Islamic modernist assumptions were embedded within his account of the history of Nigeria. Similarly, some of the key works about the history of the 19th century that were written during this period then become for me kind of primary sources, because I look at how historians during this period were constructing the past and how that informed the politics of the moment. Okay, in terms of the structure of the book, so in the 5 core chapters, I look first at the global circulation of ideas among British colonial authorities about Islam, about educating Muslims, about the dangers that the British saw in educating Muslims, how they wanted to shape particular kinds of educated Muslims, but then they would fear their own graduates, worry about the sort of subversive potential of the graduates. The second chapter then looks at the 2 tracks that I mentioned, the Anglophone track, the Arabophone track, traces their careers, how they, this was the generation, I should have said earlier, this was the generation that basically had the most intensive exposure to colonialism. So if you look at Ahmadu Bello, and he says this basically himself, he was born in either 1909 or 1910, so just a few years after the colonial project started, and he lived till 1966, so just a few years after it started. So unlike their fathers, the fathers of this generation, who were maybe adults by the time of the British colonial conquest, and unlike younger people who were maybe, even some of the younger elite, like Sheikh Shagari and people like that, who were maybe only, around the age of 30 at the time of the transition to independence, figures like Ahmadu Bello were basically square in the middle of the colonial period. So they went to school often in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and then became junior administrators or junior clerks. Oftentimes they came back to, for further study, they would be sent, the Arabophone track, the best were sent to Sudan, the best of the Anglophone, or they would sometimes be sent to the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. The best of the Anglophone track were sent to, to do studies on local government and so forth in the UK. Then they would come back and they would move into very top positions in the colonial service. And a lot of them, I should say, also in their early careers were school teachers. The third chapter then looks at print culture, in particular, some of the circulation of Islamic modernist ideas in books for children, in books aimed, as I was saying before, at the kind of lay literate Muslim. And I'll talk more about that in a second. The fourth chapter looks at reforms and new institution creation in the transition to independence, especially in the sphere of law and in the sphere of higher education. So the figures whom I've been talking about, the Anglophones, the Arabophones, were the managers of the transition to independence in some key ways. For example, at independence, there was substantial pressure from departing colonial power, substantial pressure on northern Nigeria to curtail the scope of Islamic law. And so the graduates of colonial schools, including on the Arabophone side, were key to that process in terms of visiting Sudan and Pakistan and Libya to see how their legal systems functioned in terms of helping to draft the new code and in terms of selling it to a society that had some conservative elements that were very opposed to curtailing the scope of the Sharia application. The fifth chapter I'll also say more about in a second, but here I look at how British historians, Southern Nigerian historians, third country nationals, and Northern Nigerian informants all kind of work together to narrate the history, especially of what's called the Sokoto Caliphate or the 19th century jihads, and how talking about the 19th century was very key to defining what it meant or imagining what it meant to be a Northern Nigerian Muslim during the transition to independence. Okay. To look a little bit more then at 2 of those chapters in detail, So the third chapter about the print culture and the public sphere first looks at how the language itself, the Hausa language itself, was very affected by colonial policies. So the British put a tremendous amount of effort into standardizing and promoting the Hausa language, and in making a transition from what was called Hausa Ajami, so Hausa written in the Arabic script, and promoting instead Hausa written in Roman characters with the Latin script. This was called Hausa Boko. So anyway, Boko, maybe we could talk about later, very complicated word. But and so this then became the key language of this elite Islamic public sphere, in my view. Not just the Hausa language, but specifically Hausa printed and written in Roman characters. And you know, so Gaskia Tafikwabo, the newspaper and literature, like I'm talking about, obviously if it was read out loud, it could have been understood by any Hausa speaker. But the printing it in, with in the Roman script, I think made it particularly accessible, fitted its accessibility in terms of reading to graduates of the colonial schools and to other administrators. So again, this was a fairly elite-driven kind of public sphere. And then I look at how some of the texts that circulated in the period, whether for adults or children, aimed at or sort of encoded the idea that Islam canon should be debated extensively, that lay Muslims can and should access sources for themselves, that the ordinary Muslim canon should be able to learn and master the rules of fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence. So the text that I have here is key to, or is a key source for me in the chapter. This is Worship and Rule of Muslim Religion by Hadaru Binji, who was another key graduate of the school. I wonder if can everybody hear me okay? Okay. And so I look at this text, which is basically a kind of reorganized version of a classical Maliki manual called the Risala. So the Risala dates from the very late 10th century. The core text that's used teaching Islamic law and Maliki fiqh across West Africa. In this book, Ibadah de Hukunchi, Binji kind of takes the Risala, reorganizes it in various ways, I think, to make it more suited to the kinds of public that he was addressing. So whereas, for example, in the Risala, kind of assumed the reader would be able to follow the hadith reports, the Quranic verses that are sort of blended into text as the writer writes. In Binji Ibadah de Hukunchi, he's sort of spelling this out more, listing things with numbers. He's addressing the audience, I think, in a fundamentally different way than the Risala does. And he says in there, and the other kinds of Islamic modernist authors in Nigeria said this time, better to read sorts of texts with a sheikh, but clearly the texts were meant to be read also on one's own if one wanted to. Whereas texts like the Risala generally read, with a sheikh in a very kind of tutorial way. Okay, so this is a look then at one chapter. The last chapter looks at history writing. And so I look at state support for history writing projects, how archives were built, transformed this time, especially through the collection and photocopy manuscripts, which had been held mostly in private hands and private libraries, but were brought together into an archive. How historians at this time, for various reasons, constantly shifted previous accounts of the Sokoto Jihad, which had been very ethnicity-centered and had focused on the Fulani, sometimes in a very crudely sort of racist way, and how they shifted to a more Islam-centered narrative and described the Sokoto Jihad as being animated not by an ethnic power grab, but by a devout pulses, the idea of creating a just Islamic society. And then I look at specifically the, as I mentioned, the British historians, Northern Nigerian informants who collaborated. And it's interesting to look at some of the power differentials. Oftentimes, the publications would be by the British historian or sometimes by the Southern Nigerian historians, but it was clear that they had relied heavily on Northern Nigerian informants to assemble the manuscripts in the first place, sometimes to know what they were looking at and so forth. So it was an interesting, I call it sort of co-narration, but in a very sort of unequal way. And then I look at how, all this overlap with Ahmadu Bello's political project. So I don't think that the historians, were setting out to please Ahmadu Bello. I don't think that they were paid by him to write certain kinds of histories, but they were aware that this kind of history was very politically useful to him, right? And that he depicted, he was, and also very much emphasized that he was the great-great-grandson of Usman Dan Fodio, the great-grandson of Mohammed Bello, these key movers in the 19th century, what became Nigeria. And so this kind of revisionist history writing, which was kind of, which was, I think we could say, a kind of great man of history narrative focused on, Usman Dan Fodio, Mohammed Bello, Abdullahi Dan Fodio, is kind of great men of history. Even the non-Muslim writers among the British historians were very, I think, in awe of Dan Fodio. All of this then became politically useful for Ahmed Bello. To look just quickly at a couple of quotations. Here you have Bello from his own memoir, looking, giving his own view of kind of the relationship between the past and present. I'll read part of it here. The train, the car, the lorry, aeroplane, telephone, hospital, the dispensary, the school, the college, the fertilizer, the hypodermic syringe have transformed Uthman Dan Fodio's world. But the basis is still there. The old loyalties, the old decencies, the old beliefs still hold the people of this varied region together. So presenting himself very much as the heir to Dan Fodio, sometimes a little bit of almost condescension toward the past, saying I'm the modernizer who will, take us to the future, but then really placing the basis for Northern Nigerian unity and identity on his own ancestors. Here's another quotation then from Mervyn Hiskett, one of the key British historians during this time, talking about his book, The Sword of Truth, which is effectively a biography of Dan Fodio, and kind of acknowledge, several decades later, basically, yes, this kind of work was from the perspective of of Dan Fodio and what's called the Fodiawa, that this, again, that this kind of great man of history narrative was there. Okay. In terms of where I conclude the book, I look at, again, back to Habermas. Habermas is, I think, again, pretty frankly, elitist. His depiction of the public sphere, sees the public sphere as kind of space where well-informed, educated people can exchange ideas, meritocratic and sort of rational basis. Habermas, in my view, kind of depicts that as being ruined by mass democracy and mass media. So would that apply to Nigeria, and how? So I look at kind of what there's what we could call still a public sphere of sorts in post 1966 Nigeria, or whether Habermas can tell us something about whether there's whether mass democracy and mass participation in politics ends up fragmenting things so much so that it's basically then a sort of zero-sum debate rather than this rational critical public sphere. And then I ask whether there was something like a counter-public in independence era Northern Nigeria, and I give sort of a qualified no about the Sufi orders, whether they played this sort of role as a counter-public. I think I'll pause there. I think maybe then we should save the Sahel discussion for the Q&A if folks want to get into that.